Widow's Hollow. What the forest remembers. There are places where the woods lean in too close, where the trees don't just grow, they remember. Widow's Hollow is one of those places, or rather, it was. There is no Widow's Hollow on modern maps. It has no postal code, no power lines, no jurisdiction. It is the blank between counties, the silence on satellite images. But memory lives longer in soil than it does in paper, and something in the hollow will never forget what happened there. The last ranger who tried to mark it down was named Eli Carpenter. His report never made it into the official logs, but I recovered the audio from his body cam. The following is a transcript of the first 5 minutes. October 3rd. Entering southern quadrant of Ridge Trail. 2 hikers, mid-20s, reported missing 3 days ago. Coordinates pinged last at 349440-83.2511. Light pack, overnight gear. Trails mostly clear, fog sitting low. Birds are quiet. Weird. There's a smell like turned earth and honeysuckle. Fresh. Unseasonal. Eli found the camp just off the main path. Neatly arranged. Perfectly undisturbed. Split by a young sapling that hadn't been there a week ago. And around the site were more saplings, a dozen or more, each evenly spaced in a wide circle. Their branches curled like ribs. Their bark still slick with morning dew. One had a boot print on its base, where someone had likely tried to stop it from growing. It didn't work. Jesus, they pitched camp inside the circle? No, it wasn't here. These trees weren't here. You can't grow a pine that fast. He bends to pick up a sleeping bag half-zipped, but recoils. A root snakes up through the lining. Still soft, still wet. That's when he hears it. Something sobbed underfoot. A thud that shouldn't be a thud. He pushes back a patch of moss and uncovers a heart-shaped locket, half sunk in the dirt, gold-plated, scratched, but unmistakably recent. There's something strange about it. Eli turns it over. His breath catches. His own name is engraved on the back. What the hell? I didn't drop this. Mine's at home. Why would this be? He tries to open it. It hums. Faint, mechanical, almost electrical, but not quite. More like a cat's purr. Or the low thrum of a cello bow dragged against air. Okay, no, that's not right. Then the camera stutters. There's a distortion. Frames repeating. Flickering. Who's there? The forest doesn't answer, and then it does. A voice from behind. From above. From everywhere. Eli! Not a scream. Not a whisper. A knowing. Familiar and wrong. Like hearing your childhood nickname in the voice of someone who's never met you. The mic captures his breath hitch. His footsteps fast now. Snapping twigs. Gear bouncing. Running. Crashing through brush. But the voice follows. Eli. Closer. Louder. The same word. But not the same tone. He makes it 50 yards before the audio turns static. The last thing the footage shows before going dark is a branch, just one, lowering itself gently into frame as if offering him something. And in the background, just barely audible, the sound of roots pulling themselves deeper into soil. He ran, but the trees ran with him. Arrival in Widow's Hollow.
The map wasn't complete. It had been torn. Deliberately, I think. From the binding of my great-grandfather's journal. A brown scrap tucked between pages on sonic resonance and sacred geometry. It showed only a corner of North Carolina's Nantala Forest, faded ink, brittle paper, but one name circled in red pencil, Widow's Hollow. And beside it, in his unmistakable scrawl, do not stay past sundown. I arrived in early October. Just at the first edge of autumn curled the leaves into gold and rust. The drive from Asheville twisted like a ribbon dropped by a careless god. Tight switchbacks, a dense canopy, no cell service. The world narrowed to trees and silence. It was too quiet. Bird song vanished past a certain elevation. The wind died, despite the limbs still swaying. Even the engine of my rental car began to sound out of place. Not unwelcome, exactly, just noticed. Heard. The town nearest the hollow was called Sable Creek, population maybe 200, and most of them ghosts in waiting. I introduced myself as a visiting folklorist, here on a grant to collect oral histories. This wasn't entirely false. The woman at the inn was polite enough, in the way people are when they want you gone quickly and quietly. She handed over the brass room key without asking many questions. But before I left the check-in desk, she said, "Don't forget your coat, Miss Holmes. The hollow gets cold after dark. But I reckon you won't be staying that long." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She'd already turned the vacancy sign off. The inn sat at the edge of town, like it was daring the forest to take one more bite. The paint peeled, the porch sagged, and the wind chimes had long since tangled into knots. My room smelled faintly of cedar and old hymnals. That evening, I made my first pass through the town on foot. I stopped at the gas station for water and a local road atlas. Anything more recent than the 1972 topographic map I'd been cross-referencing. The man behind the register had the thinness of someone always listening for something behind him. When I asked if he'd heard of Widow's Hollow, he didn't answer. Not at first. Then he scratched the back of his neck, eyes still on the counter, and said, "No one goes in after dark. Not for fire. Not for God. Not even for kin. The ground there don't forget." He didn't charge me for the map. I walked the outskirts the next morning. The sky was clear, but the light never reached the forest floor. The trees were thick-armed and moss-choked. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't growing so much as waiting. A pine cone dropped 10 feet in front of me. There was no wind. I found the ranger station just before noon. The building was squat, utilitarian, and locked from the inside. A young woman, maybe 30, let me in after a long pause. She said her name was Kara. Her uniform was crisp, her expression not. "You're with the university?" she asked. "Not exactly," I said. "Then you're with the podcast people?" "No." "Good." She led me down a narrow hallway to a community board covered in missing person flyers, local announcements, and out-of-date hunting regulations. In the top left corner, 2 grainy photographs had been pinned, side by side. The missing hikers. Names: Jonas Keene, 27. Maya Brell, 25. They'd vanished 6 weeks prior. No remains, no gear recovered. Just an empty tent and, according to an off-the-record report I would later acquire, unseasonal saplings growing in a perfect circle where the camp had once stood. But it was the drawings that made my breath catch. Someone had taken a pencil, dull but insistent, and traced tree rings over Jonas's face. Concentric circles, neat, deliberate, growing outward from the left eye like a bullseye. "Is that from the search party?" I asked. Kara shook her head.
"It was like that when I got here last week."
I asked who posted the flyers. She said she didn't know. No one had officially requested them. Later, I sat on the porch of the inn, flipping through the torn journal page again. Widow's Hollow. The only way to reach it on foot was a trail that hadn't been maintained in over 70 years. A ranger had marked it as unsafe, erosion, rock slide hazard. And yet, when I followed the path the next morning, I found no erosion, no slide. Just a gate, wrought iron, half swallowed by ivy with the words, "Widow's Hollow Chapel Grounds," rusted above the arch. Someone had recently oiled the hinges. I didn't go in. Not yet. Because the sun was sinking too fast, and I remembered the warning, "Do not stay past sundown." The town that was removed. There was a kind of silence that settles in old historical societies, a hush not born of reverence, but of avoidance, the kind of quiet that happens when the truth has been buried too shallow, and everyone agrees not to kick up dust. The Sable Creek Historical Society was a converted funeral parlor, its wainscoting painted over in a color the curator called sunset cream, but which looked more like spoiled milk. The bell above the door chimed on entry, 3 tones, descending. It felt unintentional. It felt like a warning. I introduced myself again. Folklorist. Archival research. Appalachian folkways. The woman behind the desk didn't look up.
"You're here about the hollow,"
she said, not asked. I waited for her to tell me to leave. She didn't. Instead, she handed me a clipboard and a small brass key with a fox carved into the bow.
"Room 3, bottom drawer. If anything's missing, it was like that before."
Room 3 had the thick smell of old paper and forgotten things. Dust floated in a shaft of light from a narrow window that hadn't been opened in years. The files were organized in a system only their creator would understand. Part Dewey Decimal, part cosmic joke. I found the drawer by accident. It stuck on the way out, catching on something warped inside. The folder was brittle with time, but the label was still legible. Widow's Hollow. Incorporated 1871. Disbanded 1946. That's the word they used, disbanded, like a club that had lived its interest, like a gathering that had simply forgotten to meet again. But the documents told another story. The town's death began quietly. Failed crops, unseasonal frosts, sudden illness. Then came the disappearances. First a girl of 6. Then her father the next week. By summer's end, 12 were gone. No bodies, no sign of struggle. Just boots left on doorsteps and clothes folded beneath trees. A 1945 letter from the county magistrate read, "Too many lost, soil not yielding, reports of unnatural tree growth, recommendation, dissolve town charter and reroute remaining families, file no obituaries." The phrase struck me. File no obituaries. Erasure disguised as mercy. There were no photos of the town. Not one. Each labeled image, schoolhouse, post office, chapel, had been removed, replaced with blank space or sketch renderings. Even the composite photo of the town founders was gone, leaving only thumbtack holes and a penciled-in word in the margin. Rooted. The only images that remained were drawings. Charcoal sketches of twisted trees with oddly human silhouettes. And mounds. Low, rounded shapes arranged like cairns with no markers, no crosses. Some had faint outlines suggesting limbs underneath. All of them had a single sapling growing from the center. One sketch had a handwritten note at the bottom. The children still bloom first. It was then I found something that didn't belong. A leather-bound folder with my great-grandfather's handwriting on the spine. The same angular script I'd followed through a dozen other investigations. The folder was dated 1932. Inside were notes from a field visit. He had come to Widow's Hollow under contract with the Society for Anomalous Inquiry, a fringe organization that straddled the line between folklore and forbidden science. His notes were written in haste. Soil irregularities consistent with charged organic material. Saplings mimic human posture. Estimated 1-to-1 mass to growth correlation. Root structures unusually social. Entangled beyond necessity. Anthropogenic topiary. Sentient patterning. Burial or birth unclear. Retreat advised. It was one of only 3 times in all his writings that he used that last phrase, and the other 2 had not ended well. I stepped outside the archives just as the sun began to sink behind the trees. The air had cooled, but the stillness remained. The kind of quiet that fills a vacuum, not absence, but presence withheld. I looked down at my boots. They were speckled with pine needles, but I'd never stepped under a tree that day. Back in my room, I spread the sketches across the bedspread. Something itched behind my eyes. The patterns. They weren't just random. The mounds, the trees, they formed rings, spirals, glyphs, crop circles made of bone and root. I placed the torn map next to the largest drawing. The ridges of the mountain, the shape of the tree line, they matched. My great-grandfather hadn't just circled Widow's Hollow. He'd marked a place inside it, a center point. Whatever happened here didn't end in 1946. It was interred, and something in the ground had learned how to wait. Into the hollow. I've walked into haunted places before. Homes that remembered too much. Churches that whispered back. Archives with paper that bled. But Widow's Hollow didn't feel haunted. It felt attentive. The forest did not watch me. It listened. I entered at 3:12 p.m. Sunset wouldn't fall until 6:41, according to the almanac, but I'd marked my limits at 6:15. I'd learned the hard way that the dark rarely waits for math. I carried only the essentials. A printout of the 1932 map, torn but legible. A trail guide from the 1970s. Outdated, but oddly consistent. EMF gear tucked into my coat pocket. A pendant from the ranger's locket. Borrowed, examined, and returned without a single fingerprint. Not even mine. I'd also tucked salt into a handkerchief in my boot. Just in case. Widow's Hollow wasn't where it had been. The trail forked early, almost immediately, as if testing resolve. My compass spun twice before settling south by southwest, then reversed when I turned around. Moss grew on all sides of the trees. Birds were absent. It wasn't quiet. It was full. The way a held breath is full. The way a grave is full. A half-mile in, the forest changed. Not in composition, but in design. Trees arched toward one another, curving at identical degrees, forming paths too symmetrical to be accidental. They moved like dancers mid-bow, coordinated, graceful, inevitable. And beneath the canopy, patterns. Root systems exposed, just enough to form spirals. Saplings grouped in threes. Branches aligned like rib cages. It was too precise, too curated. I whispered, "Show me." And the EMF reader in my coat buzzed once, then stilled. That's when I found the well. It sat just off the path, concealed beneath a curtain of honeysuckle. Its stones were smoothed with age, moss soft and damp. There was no bucket, no rope, just a black throat in the earth. Carved into the rim, almost eroded to illegibility, were 4 words. We remember. Do you? Something inside me flinched. Further in, the light began to bend. That's the only way I can describe it. Shadows stretched in directions that didn't match their source. My own silhouette flickered once, briefly, taking the shape of something taller, or maybe older. And then, just off the main trail, I saw her. A sapling, slender, fresh, bark the color of dried blood. She was shaped like a woman frozen in scream. Arms twisted overhead into desperate branches, torso curved backward. The bark split down the belly like something trying to be born. Her face was almost formed, not detailed, but present. It wasn't a sculpture. It had grown that way. I reached out, not to touch, but to acknowledge, and the EMF meter spiked. As the light began to amber, I heard the roots singing. Not melody, not language, just vibration. Low and slow, like the groaning of ice beneath boots. It pulsed up through my shoes and into my ribs, a sub-audible chant that bypassed ears and headed straight for marrow. I stood still, listened, let the forest speak. Words never came, only presence. I left at 6:07 p.m., not because it was dark, but because the shadows had started to reach for me. One crossed the path ahead, low and flickering, like the shadow of a child on all fours. I didn't look back. Looking back is an invitation, and I wasn't ready to RSVP. Back in the safety of the car, I turned on the recorder and spoke aloud before the thoughts could twist themselves. The forest is curated, intentional. Something arranges its limbs with meaning. The well implies memory. The sapling implies sacrifice. And the chanting. The chanting knows your name before you say it. The locket in my coat vibrated. Just once. Like a heartbeat made of brass. When I opened my notebook to log the day's notes, a phrase had already been written in my handwriting. She waits at the roots. The botanist's notes. Back at the inn, the kettle whistled like it had something to warn me about. I poured the tea anyway, left it to steep, and laid the day's findings across the bed like tarot cards. Trail photos, EMF readings, bark samples, and the page torn from the chapel well. None of them felt like the key. The key came later, folded into the back of an old ledger I'd checked out from the local historical society. A book about Appalachian flora, misfiled between maps of early coal towns. I'd almost left it behind. But I didn't. Inside, tucked between pages from rhizomes and rare molds, was a brittle envelope marked simply, "To Balthazar Holmes. Urgent. From L. Brightwell." My great-grandfather. And a name I'd never heard before. The letter was dated June 3rd, 1932. "Balthazar, you asked me to give the forest a name, but this is no forest. This is a mouth. It eats memory and spits out shape. I've never seen soil behave like this. It's not just rich, it's over-memory. That's the word I keep writing down. The soil remembers. It holds imprints, not just bones, but final words, final screams, final sins." I planted markers in May, simple flags of red yarn. By the next morning, the ground had grown replicas of my own hands, clutching the string. One of the locals told me about Madeline Arrow. She was the last one to say the forest's true name aloud. She was buried that night. No service, no stone. I believe she named it, and in so doing, entered it. I believe she never fully left. I believe the roots speak her name in the dark. The letter ended with a drawing. Roots spiraling like fingerprints. A single word etched in the center. Arrow. I stared at the name for a long time. Not because it frightened me, but because it didn't. It felt familiar, like a lullaby half remembered, like something I might have once whispered in sleep. I flipped through the remaining pages of the ledger, heart thudding, until I found a photo tucked in the back cover. The caption had faded, but someone had written in fountain pen, "M. Arrow, 1931, Survey Station 4. She stood by a ridge of pine, hand resting on a soil core drill, smiling slightly. Her hair was loose, her coat cinched tight at the waist. She was me, or I was her. Same cheekbones, same dark eyes, same frown hiding behind the mouth. The tea had grown cold. The inn's walls creaked in protest as the wind picked up outside. A gust blew open the window, scattering bark samples across the floor like fallen teeth. I didn't chase them. I just stood, staring at the photo, hearing again what the ranger's locket had hummed when I'd first picked it up. A note not of warning, but of welcome. The roots preserve not just the dead, but the moments that killed them. I reread that line and felt the hollow settle deeper inside me. Was I following in my great-grandfather's footsteps, or retracing someone else's entirely? Tomorrow, I go back in. I'll bring salt and matches and a voice recorder. I will not speak the name aloud. Not yet. Not until the hollow asks me to. Sleepwalking roots. I woke to silence. Not the kind you expect from a rural inn. The occasional creak of the old pipes. A raccoon rattling in the walls. But a silence so dense, it rang. The lamp was still on. My boots were still by the door. But my feet were dirty, black-soled, as if I'd walked barefoot through wet soil. When I turned my palm over, I found a dried leaf pressed against it like a bandage. My pack was unzipped. I hadn't done that. I checked my camera first. It was missing. Then the external mic, still connected to the small field recorder I'd left on the bedside table. Its light was blinking red. Recording. 4 hours, 26 minutes, 12 seconds. I stopped it. Rewound. Hit play. Field recording. Widow's Hollow Case. Night 3. 000043. Soft static. Wind through trees. 000215. A melody. Childlike. Tuneless. Half hummed, half sung. 000504. Crunching. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. 000722. A voice. My voice. Only sadder. Older. Come home, it whispered. We forgive you. Forgiveness implies a sin. But I'd only just arrived. I checked the clock again. 2:56 a.m. I searched the room. No sign of the camera. My laptop was undisturbed. The door was still locked from the inside. I lifted the blanket. There, nestled beneath the folds of the quilt, was the camera. Lens cap off. Still warm. I didn't remember taking a single photo. There was only one file. I opened it. It was me. Sleeping. A thin braid of vines spiraled around my arm, tucked up beside my cheek like a child's doll. One looped gently around my throat, not tight, but possessive. Protective. I zoomed in. The vines weren't resting on me. They were growing from me. From my fingertips, my collarbone, my hairline. But when I looked down at my own arms in that moment, there was nothing. No leaves, no vines, just skin, freckled and shaken. Outside, the wind shifted. I heard leaves brush the window. No branches, just leaves. A sound like brushing hair. Familiar. Something small thumped against the door. Once. Twice. Then silence again. I didn't open it. I don't think I needed to. The camera image was time-stamped. 1:11 a.m. When I checked the mirror, I found soil under my nails. I played the recording back again. It wasn't just my voice, I realized. It was Madeline's. Or maybe we were just harmonizing. The words had changed slightly. Come home, she said. The roots remember you.
We forgive what the world made you forget.
I checked the soles of my feet again. There, on the arch of my left foot, a faint impression, like a sigil drawn in dust. 3 concentric circles. A tree at the center. Its roots formed a spiral. Sleepwalking implies unconsciousness, but I remember the air, damp, fragrant, heavy with memory. I remember moss beneath my toes. I remember a voice that felt like mine before language. Tomorrow I'll return to the hollow, not to investigate, to listen. The soil is telling me something, and maybe, just maybe, so am I. The living graveyard. I've walked enough graveyards to know when one has been disguised. You can feel it underfoot, the hush in the loam, the hush in your breath, as though the soil itself is holding its tongue. Today, the light barely made it through the canopy. A sallow autumn sun filtered through browning leaves, and the wind moved like someone trying not to be noticed. Roughly 2 miles past the broken well, I found them. Trees, young enough not to have been in the original aerial surveys, but old enough to show rings of growth. Their trunks stood in deliberate lines, in formations too precise to be accidental, like soldiers at attention, or mourners, or markers. I laid out 4 motion sensors in a square around the clearing, checking them twice. No animal prints. No wind strong enough to explain what I saw next. I began to dig, just shallow, just a test scrape. At the base of the 3rd tree, barely 6 inches down, my trowel hit something pale and curved. A fragment of a jawbone, human, not bleached by time. The roots wrapped around it like fingers. I didn't speak aloud. I didn't have to. The forest was already listening. I returned to the fallen log where I'd left my pack, pulled out my field recorder, played back a 14-second loop of the chanting I'd captured the night before, the one that sounded like roots whispering. And that's when it happened. Tree number 6, 2nd row from the back, shifted, only slightly, no creak, no wind, just a lean, toward me, as if hearing its name for the first time in years. Back at the inn, I reviewed my great-grandfather's journal again, flipping past old sketches of root systems shaped like rib cages, topographic maps marked in red ink. Then on a page tucked behind a letter from the botanist, one I hadn't noticed before, I found this. They plant the body, but keep the soil above ground, rooted to the breath. He had underlined it twice. It might have stayed abstract, might have remained theory, if not for the photograph. After leaving the forest, I felt winded, tight-chested. I chalked it up to nerves, to damp mountain air. But when the pressure didn't subside, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took an X-ray of myself. There's a portable unit I travel with when working in particularly remote areas, borrowed, technically, from a partner in Baltimore. The image developed slowly, too slowly. The screen flickered once, then again. When it resolved, I saw moss. Not an impression, not a trick of light. A ghostly haze around the bronchial branches. Filigree tendrils, green-gray shadows winding like ivy inside my lungs. No cough, no fever, just the growing sense that something had taken root. That night, I tried not to sleep, but the forest hummed through the walls, and in the silence between heartbeats I could hear. I heard myself breathing in chorus with something else. Interview with the midwife of the Hollow. Field log, recorded on microcassette. Location: Ash Grove State Long-Term Care Facility, room 213. When I first asked about Cora Nance, the nurse gave me a long look. Said the woman hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. Might open her eyes, might hum to herself, but mostly she just listens. Listens to what? I asked. The nurse just shrugged. Cora's room was a pale square box. Linoleum floors, beige drapes, a mechanical bed that hummed faintly like a trapped insect. There were no photographs, no flowers, no indication that this woman had once belonged to a place called Widow's Hollow. She was small in the way that only the very old become, folded in on herself like parchment, her skin the color of old birch bark. Her hands were curled like roots that had forgotten how to reach. But her eyes were open, not startled, not curious, just awake. I introduced myself gently, told her I was tracing an old case from her hometown. A lost town, I said, carefully avoiding the word erased. No response. I placed a photograph on the bedside table, the image I'd found of Madeline Aro, the woman buried alive, the woman who looked too much like me to dismiss as coincidence. Cora blinked once, then again. Then in a voice that sounded like the crackle of dry leaves underfoot, she whispered, "She bore the Hollow's name." I leaned closer, barely breathing. "You remember her?" Cora nodded, emotion like a branch bending under the weight of a bird. "Spoke it on purpose, planted herself, so we could live." She didn't speak again for several minutes. I waited, recorder running. The silence felt ceremonial. Then Cora moved, her left hand sliding slowly over the paper napkin that held her untouched lunch. With a shaking finger, she began to draw a spiral, but not a simple swirl. This spiral had depth, layers, vines curling inward and then outward again. A root system, not just a symbol. She circled one point in the center and tapped it with her finger. Then she whispered, "The name was a seed." I scanned the drawing into my tablet and cross-referenced it against the drone photos I'd taken last week. One aerial pass of Widow's Hollow had revealed something odd. A pattern in the saplings that didn't register until I saw Cora's glyph. The new growth wasn't random. It was growing in a spiral, rooted to the ruins of the chapel I'd yet to explore. The same spiral she drew. I gently asked her, "Cora, what does the forest want?" Her eyes didn't move from the glyph. She said, "Not want, remember. The ground remembers what people forget. That's why they erased the map." I pressed further. What did they forget? This time her voice trembled. "That grief has weight, has shape, and when you bury it wrong, it grows back strange." According to the scant records from Ash Grove, Cora Nance was born in 1922, the last child officially recorded as born inside Widow's Hollow. Her mother was the town's midwife. Her father, a cartographer, had disappeared in 1934. There were no records of schooling, but she was placed in state custody in 1947, 6 months after the town was officially disbanded. The in-text notes are clinical and vague. Subject speaks in old dialects, ritualistic speech patterns, soil fixation. Soil fixation. I remember thinking about how clean her fingernails were, trimmed and filed. But her palms were dark, lined like old wood and smelled faintly of myrtle. Before I left, she spoke again. "Don't let it name you." Her eyes turned for the first time to mine. And for a moment, I didn't feel like she was looking at me, but through me, as if something behind my face had stepped forward. "You look like her," she said. I swallowed. "Madeline?" She didn't answer, just smiled, sadly, gently, and began to hum. A low rhythmic sound, root sleep. The exact cadence I had heard on my recorder, the chant under the soil. That night I dreamed I was lying beneath the ground, not buried, planted. There was no weight of soil on my chest, no fear of suffocation, just warmth. The scent of cedar bark, the brush of earthworms passing like silk threads over my arms. Above me, the trees sang. Not words, not melody, just memory. I woke with soil in my ears. There's an unspoken rule among paranormal researchers. Never assume you're outside the story. Observation is participation. Documentation is a kind of communion. And I am no longer certain when I crossed the line. Cora said, "Don't let it name you." But I'm beginning to think it already has. It's not just remembering Madeline. It's remembering me. Or maybe the echo. Descent into the tree hollow. I didn't think the hollow would find it, but it was never hiding, just waiting for me to remember where I had left myself. It was nearing dusk when I returned to the chapel ruins. The forest had grown bolder in my absence. Branches bowed low over the trail, brushing against my shoulders like blind fingers. The air smelled of split cider and something sweeter beneath it, a rot clinging to memory. Beneath the chapel's collapsed nave, ivy had overtaken the stones, binding the structure like a wound scabbed over. My EMF reader trembled with static before it died completely. I didn't need it. I could feel the pull now, not electric-magnetic. Menomenek, like a forgotten word hovering on the tip of your tongue. There was a hollow beneath the hollow, and it had been calling me for some. The entrance wasn't dramatic, not a staircase or a trapdoor, no cinematic reveal, just a softened patch of ground in the middle of the chapel's old sanctuary. It gave way under my foot with a soft sigh, like the forest itself exhaling. I knelt, dug with bare hands. Beneath the moss and mulch was a narrow tunnel, root-lined and damp, descending in a slow spiral like the glyph Cora had drawn. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No insects, no wind, just the rhythmic creak of wood shifting around me, like the groan of a house that still remembers its builder's name. The chamber at the bottom was circular, perfectly so. The walls were not stone, but knotted roots, pressed so tightly together they may as well have been carved. And in those walls, faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Human visages formed from bark and barked over flesh. Not carved, not sculpted, but grown. Some were twisted in agony, others serene, all of them with closed mouths. But their eyes were open. I turned slowly, my flashlight catching pupil-shaped knots that followed me, or seemed to. One face I recognized. It took me several seconds to realize why. It was mine. In the center of the room stood a tree, or what had once been a woman. She was tall, arms raised and split into branches. Her belly bulged outward like a tree knot. Her feet melded into the earth in thick roots. Toes spread like grasping fingers. She had no mouth, but her eyes, also mine, were wide open. I don't remember kneeling, but I know I touched her. Just one hand, placed gently against the bark where her heart should be. It pulsed once, and then I heard it, not through my ears, but inside. Madeline. The voice wasn't a whisper. It wasn't sound at all. It was a remembering. And I remembered. I was Madeline Arrow. I wore a crown of cedar and bones, not for power, but protection. I had come to the Hollow in 1932 to stop something from blooming that should never have taken root. I had heard the forest whispering to people, first in dreams, then in broad daylight, and they answered. One by one, they planted themselves, voluntarily, stepping into holes as if returning home. I tried to warn them, to name the thing in the soil, but names have weight, and this one was a seed. When I spoke it aloud, the ground opened for me, and I let it. I buried myself, not to die, but to contain the awareness, this terrible blooming sentience of the land. And the land, in gratitude, remembered me, kept me, held me, until I was no longer Madeline, until I was the tree hollow. I stumbled back from the tree woman, my tree, maybe, and fell hard onto the root-covered floor. The faces on the walls blurred, wept, shifted. Some of them mouthed silent screams. Others opened their mouths to speak, but only sap dripped out. The ground beneath me was warm, wet, pulsing. I crawled toward the tunnel, heart racing. The chanting returned, not from outside, but from within me. A voice humming in my own throat that I couldn't stop. I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood. It was the only thing that I still felt was mine. Later, outside the cavern, I vomited moss, pulled 3 small leaves from between my teeth. They were shaped like fingerprints. Mine. What I saw wasn't death. It wasn't a grave. It was memory made tree, a slow cathedral of forgotten selves. The hollow didn't kill those who entered. It absorbed them, especially those who came to listen, especially those who shared its name. I've stopped sleeping. The dreams aren't mine anymore. The ground calls me Madeline when I walk, and I answer without thinking. Something is waking up down there, not to harm, not to heal, just to remember. And I'm afraid that once it finishes remembering, it will begin. The sun down ritual. I had only hours. The sun hung low, swollen and bruised, like a warning. I laid out the ritual as best I could, half from sketches in my great-grandfather's field notes, half from the glyph Cora Nance had drawn with shaking hands and fading breath. Neither of them left instructions, just images, symbols, fragments. But that's all rituals ever are, isn't it? Not spells, not commands, just offerings, just hope. The ingredients: salt from the chapel threshold, crushed sap scraped from the face of the tree hollow, bark from a tree that whispered my name, and my own blood, from where I'd bitten through my tongue days before. I traced the spiral first, the shape Cora had drawn on the back of her nursing home dinner napkin, the one that appeared in the root patterns of every new sapling. Around it, I made a wider circle of salt and sap, watching the substance sizzle when they met. The scent was sharp, sweet, almost floral, but wrong, like perfume poured over something dead. I whispered the names of the missing, one by one. Some I knew. The hikers. The ranger. A girl whose face I'd seen sketched into the back of a church hymnal with roots for hair. Others I didn't know, but the names came anyway, unbidden, delivered from the hollow of my ribs like fruit from a branch. Madeline Oro, Silas Gray, Linnie James, Ruth Holloway, John the Elder, Clara with the glass heart. They didn't sound like me, but they came from me. The forest, I think, had remembered them. And so, somehow, had I. Then came the last part. I stepped inside the salt spiral and spoke aloud. Root me in truth, not memory. The wind answered, not from above, from below. At exactly 7:06 p.m., as the last edge of the sun dipped beneath the distant ridgeline, the hollow began to move. No birds, no bugs, just trees, swaying in perfect time, like dancers returning to a rhythm they'd always known. Leaves fluttered in a soundless breeze. The air went still, but the soil breathed. Then the voices, not in one place, not in one direction, but all around me, beneath me, inside me, dozens, hundreds, all chanting, not just a name, my name, Trinity Madeline Holmes, Madeline Trinity Arwo. Madeline rooted, Trinity returned. It didn't feel like worship. It felt like recognition, like the land had finally remembered what it had lost. The ground cracked, not violently, but like something exhaling after holding its breath for a century. I turned toward the chapel ruins, drawn there like a needle to a compass. The ground glowed faintly beneath the moss, my salt circle pulsing with slow light. From the direction of the tree hollow chamber came a groaning, like bark splitting in winter. I ran. When I reached the opening to the underground cavern, I saw her. The woman tree, the tree hollow, still standing. But she was splintering. Fractures spread across her limbs. Her eyes, once wide and open, now streamed sap down barked cheeks. She turned to look at me, or maybe I only imagined she did. The root-laced ceiling shook. A final breath echoed through the chamber. We only wanted someone to remember us. And with that, She crumbled, not shattered, not felled like a tree, just disassembled into dust and bark and bone and memory. The chamber shook. Above ground, I heard soft thumps. Dozens of them. I climbed back up the spiral tunnel, heart pounding, ears ringing. Outside, the field of sapling bodies, the ones shaped like people, like fear, like grief, had collapsed. Each had fallen in place, like soldiers dismissed from formation. Not dead, not alive, just released. The wind carried the scent of cedar and iron. The trees no longer whispered my name. They no longer needed to. I don't know what the ritual did. I don't know if it banished anything, or sealed anything, or simply bore witness to what had already been described. But I know this: the hollow let go. And that letting go felt like forgiveness. Not for what had been done to it, but for what it had done to survive. There are some places that don't want to be known. Not because they are evil, but because they are still grieving. Closing the case. When I returned to town, the air had changed. It wasn't warmer, exactly, or lighter, but it no longer felt watched. No one stopped me at the gas station. No one turned away when I made eye contact. The clerk who had muttered, "The ground don't forget," now offered me a paper cup of stale coffee and asked quietly if the hollow was still hungry. I didn't know how to answer. I said, "I think it's resting now." He nodded, as if that made sense. I stayed one more night at the inn. The owner didn't ask me to sign the ledger this time. He just said, "Thank you for coming back." Not for coming through the forest, not for investigating, just for coming back. There's something sacred in return, I think. The act of re-entering a place, or a memory, or a silence you thought would never welcome you again. I flipped open the old leather-bound journal that had started this. My great-grandfather's handwriting stopped just above a sketch of a spiral tree root with one word beneath it: containment. There were no closures in his notes, only warnings. I added my own. Entry: Widow's Hollow. Resolved for now. Not haunted, inhabited. Not by spirits, but by memory that remembers itself. They weren't ghosts. They were grief that grew teeth. And still, beneath the bark, behind the hum, I think they were waiting for someone who wouldn't look away. I tucked the journal back in its case and mailed it to the same sealed archive where I'd sent the St. Elizabeth reel months ago. Someday, somebody else will read it. I hope they listen. Before I could leave town, a final package arrived for me at the inn. No return address, wrapped in bark, bound in root thread. Inside, a small seed pod, pale and dimpled, like a pulse waiting to begin. And beneath it, a chip from one of my ritual field recorders, burned around the edges. The audio should have been corrupted, but when I played it, I heard my own voice. Only calmer, stronger, as if I'd grown into the words in the moment they were spoken. "Keep growing," I said, even in the dark. As I crossed the state line, the forest faded behind me in the rear view mirror. Just trees again, but I know better. Somewhere beneath the loam, the hollow still breathes. Not in meanness, not in vengeance, but in the aching way that old things do when they're finally remembered. Let this be the final note, until the roots call again. Trinity Holmes. The Whisper Tree. They cleared the forest trail 2 months after I left. The state hired contractors to mark the old growth for survey, unaware they were walking through graves with leaves. One worker, a quiet man with a birthmark in the shape of a spiral on his shoulder, didn't show up for roll call after lunch. They found his boots, standing upright. No sign of struggle, just soft moss where the man had been. No indentations, no blood. Just a seed pod in one boot. And a sapling, 6 inches tall, growing beside it. The team abandoned the job the same day. No one filed an official report. But I received an envelope postmarked from the ranger station. Inside, a photograph of the sapling. Its bark was smooth, new, unscarred. But the leaves, 5-pronged, deep green, trembling, had grown into the unmistakable shape of an open human hand. On the back of the photograph, someone had scrawled, "They're still listening, still waiting to be heard." I pinned the photo to my wall beside the maps, marked the location in red. I won't go back, not yet, but I won't forget. Some forests grow from sunlight and rain. Others grow from silence, from names never spoken aloud, from the hunger of memory. This one grew from grief, and from that grief it made roots. The kind that wait, the kind that hold fast, the kind that remember. So if you ever walk past a place where the trees lean in too close, where the moss grows over signs, where no bird song breaks the quiet, don't whistle, don't call out, and whatever you do, don't say your name.